The universe had a peculiar sense of humor, and nowhere was this more evident than at Nexus Research Station, where the galaxy's most brilliant minds had gathered to solve the pressing question of why civilizations capable of reshaping reality couldn't manage a simple task like preventing their offspring from accidentally destroying everything within a 3-parsec radius. Dr. Quantum stood in the observation deck, watching what could generously be called a learning experience unfold in the juvenile containment facility below. 3 draconi hatchlings had somehow managed to melt through their supposedly fireproof enclosure, and were now engaged in what appeared to be a friendly competition to see who could cause the most structural damage to the station's primary support beams. The automated suppression systems had given up approximately 17 minutes ago, and the facility's AI had begun composing what sounded suspiciously like a resignation letter. "This is the 43rd containment breach this cycle," Chief Administrator Vex announced, his crystalline form flickering with what other species had learned to recognize as barely contained panic. "The insurance consortium has classified us as a catastrophic risk and suggested we consider relocating to an uninhabited dimension." The irony was lost on no one that the Draconi's Imperium had conquered 14 star systems through sheer tactical brilliance and overwhelming firepower, yet their 3-year-old hatchlings had managed to outsmart a facility designed by the galaxy's greatest engineering minds. It was as if the universe had decided that every species would excel at precisely one thing, and unfortunately for everyone involved, none of them had chosen keeping their children from accidentally committing acts of cosmic vandalism. The Void Hunters could phase through solid matter and existed partially outside normal spacetime, but their young kept getting lost in pocket dimensions and returning with items that technically shouldn't exist. The Crystalline Collective had achieved perfect harmony between technology and biology, but their offspring had an unfortunate tendency to reprogram reality according to their own aesthetic preferences. The Storm Riders had mastered the art of controlling weather patterns across entire solar systems, but their juveniles kept summoning hurricanes whenever they got excited. "What about the melodic synthesis suggestion?" Administrator Vex asked hopefully. "They've offered to harmonize the younglings into compliance." Their last attempt resulted in a resonance cascade that turned the entire facility into a musical instrument, Dr. Quantum replied dryly. "The younglings learned to play us like a symphony of chaos. The maintenance crew is still finding notes embedded in the walls." The truth was becoming increasingly apparent to everyone except the beings responsible for solving it. The galaxy's most advanced civilizations had somehow evolved past the ability to deal with the fundamental illogic of young minds. They had created beings of incredible power and intelligence, but had forgotten that their offspring would spend several years being essentially tiny agents of entropy, with no understanding of concepts like consequences or structural integrity. Enter the humans stage left, with all the grace and dignity of a species that had somehow managed to survive their own adolescence. "Sir," Administrator Vex's voice carried the particular tone of someone about to suggest something that would either save them all or result in a court-martial. "I've been reviewing the applications for our emergency childcare positions." Dr. Quantum's secondary sensors focused on the administrator. "And there's a human." The pause that followed was the kind typically associated with the moment before stars collapse into black holes. In this case, it was difficult to determine whether the outcome would be more or less catastrophic. "A human," Dr. Quantum repeated, his voice carrying the kind of disbelief usually reserved for claims of perpetual motion or functional bureaucracy. "You want to entrust the care of our most precious and dangerous offspring to a member of the species that hasn't figured out how to achieve basic planetary harmony? They're the only applicants who didn't demand hazard pay equal to the gross domestic product of a small star system," Vex pointed out. "Everyone else classified this as a combat assignment." Jake Morrison had been expecting the interview to be unusual, but the sight of a sentient crystalline being attempting to conduct a formal evaluation, while what appeared to be a living storm cloud took notes, was still something of a adjustment. What surprised him more was that both interviewers seemed significantly more nervous than he was. "So," Administrator Vex began, consulting a data slate with the careful attention typically reserved for defusing antimatter bombs, "you have experience with challenging juvenile cases?" "I've been working with kids for 15 years, Jake replied, trying not to stare at the way Dr. Quantum's form shifted colors every time he spoke. "Mostly with what you might call the difficult ones." "Define difficult." Jake considered this carefully. "Well, there was Marcus Thompson. He figured out how to hack the school's environmental controls to make it rain indoors, but only in the principal's office, And Jenny Walsh convinced her entire kindergarten class that vegetables were actually alien spores trying to take over their minds. Dr. Quantum's form flickered rapidly. And your approach to these incidents? I listened to them, Jake said simply. Turned out Marcus was having trouble at home and wanted attention. Jenny was scared because her parents were fighting about money. Once we figured out what was really bothering them, the behavior problems mostly resolved themselves. You listened to them. Administrator Vex's tone suggested he was trying to process a concept that violated several fundamental laws of physics. It's not complicated, Jake continued. Kids act out when they're scared, frustrated, or feeling ignored. You just have to figure out what they need and help them feel secure. Dr. Quantum, who had been observing silently, finally spoke. This emotional approach contradicts established behavioral modification protocols. We have developed comprehensive conditioning systems based on advanced psychological manipulation techniques. How's that working out? Jake asked. The resulting silence was more eloquent than any formal report could have been. The human methodology appears fundamentally flawed, Dr. Quantum continued. Emotional attachment to genetically unrelated offspring serves no logical evolutionary purpose. It represents an inefficient allocation of resources and energy. Jake shrugged. Maybe so, but it works. 4 hours later, Jake found himself standing in what could only be described as a maximum security nursery, wondering if he'd made a spectacular mistake. The facility looked like someone had crossed a daycare center with a military bunker, complete with reinforced walls, emergency containment fields, and what appeared to be a small medical bay equipped for various forms of exotic trauma. These are Blaze, Shadow, Crystal, and Tempest, Administrator Vex announced, gesturing toward 4 creatures that defied every assumption Jake had ever made about the nature of childhood. Blaze was a small dragon-like being whose scales glowed with internal fire. Shadow seemed to exist in a state of constant partial transparency, occasionally flickering in and out of visible reality. Crystal appeared to be made of living gemstone that refracted light in impossible ways. Tempest was surrounded by a miniature weather system that included what looked like actual lightning. They are energetic, Vex added, which was apparently the administrative equivalent of describing a supernova as bright. Energetic was certainly one way to describe it. As Jake watched, Blaze was systematically testing the melting point of various furniture items. Shadow had somehow gotten stuck halfway through a wall and was making distressed chittering sounds. Crystal was rearranging the molecular structure of a toy block into something that hurt to look at directly. Tempest was spinning in circles, generating a small tornado that was redistributing the room's contents according to principles that defied both physics and common sense. The other caregivers, a collection of various species, were maintaining what they clearly considered a minimum safe distance. Jake could understand why. So, he said, sitting down on the floor in the middle of the chaos, what's the plan for today? All 4 younglings stopped what they were doing and stared at him. It was the kind of attention that made Jake acutely aware that he was in a room with beings who could potentially unmake him on a molecular level, and they hadn't yet figured out that this might be considered antisocial behavior. Today's curriculum focuses on advanced cognitive development and behavioral regulation, Dr. Quantum announced from behind a protective barrier. The subjects will engage with structured learning materials designed to enhance intellectual capacity while maintaining appropriate social boundaries. Sounds educational, Jake said, not moving from his position on the floor. What do you guys actually want to do? Blaze made a sound like a tea kettle having an existential crisis. Shadow managed to unstick himself from the wall and immediately began trying to phase through the floor. Crystal created a small sculpture that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the room technically contained. Tempest's weather system intensified, producing what appeared to be snow made of pure energy. They want to explore, Jake said, as if this was the most obvious conclusion in the universe. They're stuck in a room with a bunch of educational materials and adults who are too scared to play with them. Of course they're frustrated. Exploration is dangerous, Administrator Vex pointed out. The station contains over 500 critical systems that could be catastrophically compromised by curious younglings. So we make exploration safe, Jake replied. We set boundaries, we explain why they exist, and we give them choices within those limits. What followed was either the most inspired example of interspecies childcare in galactic history, or an elaborate form of suicide by proxy. Jake began simply engaging with the younglings, not trying to educate them or modify their behavior, just interacting with them as individuals. He helped Shadow figure out that phasing through objects was more fun when you had a destination in mind. He showed Blaze that controlled fire was more interesting than random destruction. He encouraged Crystal to create things that existed in the same dimensional space as everyone else. He taught Tempest that weather control was more impressive when people could actually see it happening. The other caregivers watched in horrified fascination as Jake violated every safety protocol ever written. He didn't maintain a safe distance. He didn't use behavioral conditioning techniques. He didn't even wear protective equipment. He simply sat on the floor with 4 potentially apocalyptic beings and treated them like they were children, which, as it turned out, they were. "This is highly irregular," Dr. Quantum announced after the first hour passed without any injuries, property damage, or reality-threatening incidents. "The humans' approach lacks scientific foundation." "It's working," Administrator Vex observed, and it was. The younglings were still energetic, still curious, still occasionally dangerous, but they were also responding to Jake in ways that contradicted every predictive model the facility had developed. When Blaze started to melt something inappropriate, Jake would redirect him to something that was designed to be melted. When Shadow got frustrated with a puzzle, Jake would sit with him and work through it together. When Crystal created something that threatened local space-time, Jake would admire it and then suggest variations that wouldn't accidentally tear holes in reality. When Tempest got overstimulated and started generating dangerous weather, Jake would help him find ways to express his emotions that didn't involve potential meteorological disasters. "How is he doing that?" Dr. Quantum asked, reviewing the behavioral monitoring data with the kind of expression typically reserved for discovering that mathematics had been fundamentally wrong about everything. "He's not trying to control them," Administrator Vex realized. "He's trying to understand them." Word spread through the station's communication networks with the speed of gossip in a small town. Within a week, Jake had received requests from 23 different species asking if he could help with their offspring. The Void Hunters wanted to know if he could prevent their young from getting lost in alternate dimensions. The Storm Riders needed someone who could teach their younglings to generate weather patterns that didn't violate atmospheric safety regulations. The Crystalline Collective required assistance with juvenile hive minds that kept trying to optimize reality according to their own preferences. "This is becoming a diplomatic situation," Administrator Vex reported to the Emergency Council session. "The Galactic Safety Board is demanding an investigation into human childcare methodologies. They're claiming that emotional attachment to unrelated offspring violates the natural order of species development." "Development? What's the human's response?" Dr. Quantum asked. Said, and I quote, "Tell them to spend a day with the kids, and then we'll talk about natural order." The safety board arrived with full investigative protocols, recording equipment, and what appeared to be a trauma response team. They were prepared to document dangerous and unethical practices that would justify immediate regulatory intervention. What they found was Jake sitting on the floor with a mixed group of younglings from 8 different species, helping them build what appeared to be a scale model of the station out of various materials, some of which technically shouldn't exist in normal space. "This is a collaborative engineering project," he was explaining to a young Void Hunter who was carefully placing components that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. "We're learning about structural integrity, resource management, and the importance of building codes that account for exotic matter interactions." The younglings were completely absorbed in their work. Blaze was providing controlled heat for welding joints, his fire carefully regulated to avoid damaging the more delicate components. Shadow was testing the stability of various connections by phasing through them, reporting back on structural weaknesses. Crystal was creating transparent support elements that distributed stress across multiple dimensional matrices. Tempest was generating small, precise air currents to help position delicate components. "Where are the behavioral modification protocols?" Dr. Quantum demanded. "Where are the safety restraints?" added Safety Coordinator Nexus. "Where," asked Ethics Supervisor Flux, "are the containment fields?" Jake looked up from the construction project. "They don't need them. They're just kids who want to build something cool. They are inherently dangerous beings with capabilities that exceed most military weapons," Safety Coordinated Nexus pointed out. "Yeah," Jake agreed, "but they're also 4 years old. Being dangerous doesn't mean you don't want someone to be proud of what you've made." The investigation that followed was the most comprehensive analysis of interspecies childcare methodology ever conducted. Teams of researchers studied Jake's techniques, interviewed the younglings, analyzed behavioral data, and attempted to understand how one human had managed to solve a problem that had baffled the galaxy's greatest minds. The findings were both revolutionary and completely inexplicable. The human approach is based on irrational emotional attachment to genetically unrelated offspring, Dr. Quantum reported to the safety board. This attachment drives protective and nurturing behaviors that prioritize the youngling's psychological well-being over efficiency and control. Sounds highly inefficient, Safety Coordinator Nexus observed. It is, Dr. Quantum agreed. It's also remarkably effective. The younglings under human care demonstrate improved emotional regulation, reduced destructive behaviors, and enhanced social development. Most significantly, they exhibit what can only be described as contentment. The word hung in the air like a foreign concept, which, for most of the assembled beings, it was. The human appears to operate on the principle that understanding and meeting the younglings' emotional needs is more important than controlling their behavior, Dr. Quantum continued. This results in voluntary cooperation rather than enforced compliance. And the other species? Ethics Supervisor Flux asked. They're attempting to replicate the human approach with limited success. The Void Hunters have developed a mathematical model for emotional attachment that somehow makes the concept even more incomprehensible. The Storm Riders are generating what they believe are nurturing weather patterns, but they're actually creating atmospheric conditions that induce anxiety. The Crystalline Collective has attempted to create a hive mind protocol for group childcare that has somehow managed to make the experience more terrifying for everyone involved. 1 year later, Jake Morrison held the title of Director of Interspecies Youth Development, a position that hadn't existed before humans joined the Galactic community and probably shouldn't have needed to exist at all. His office was located in the newly constructed Harmony Center, a facility that looked more like an adventure playground than a research station. The demand for human childcare specialists has exceeded our ability to train qualified personnel, Administrator Vex reported during their weekly briefing. We have requests from 67 different species, including some that we didn't previously know reproduced. We're working on training programs, Jake replied, watching through his office window as a group of younglings from 12 different species collaborated on what appeared to be an art project involving controlled fusion reactions and interpretive dance. The key is helping people understand that taking care of kids isn't about making them behave or teaching them to be something they're not. It's about helping them become the best version of what they already are. The irony was not lost on anyone that the galaxy's most feared predators now maintained waiting lists for human childcare services. The Draconis Imperium had established a special youth development program staffed entirely by humans. The Void Hunters had opened their first public nursery in recorded history. The Storm Riders had started a cultural exchange program that paired their younglings with human families for extended visits. There's something I still don't understand, Dr. Quantum said during one of his regular visits to observe the program. Blaze, Shadow, Crystal, and Tempest had grown considerably, but still insisted on showing Jake their latest creations whenever he visited. Your species is demonstrably weaker than virtually every other species in the galaxy. You have limited natural defenses, restricted sensory capabilities, and require technological assistance to survive in most environments. Why are you so effective at caring for our young? Jake watched as Tempest demonstrated a new weather pattern for a group of impressed crystalline juveniles, creating a miniature rainbow that existed in 7 dimensions simultaneously. Maybe because we're not trying to prove how powerful we are, we're just trying to take care of them. That's not an explanation. Sure it is. Everyone else looks at your kids and sees future apex predators that need to be controlled or contained. We look at them and see children who need someone to care about them. Care. Dr. Quantum repeated the word like he was trying to decode an alien language. It's not logical, Jake admitted. It's not efficient. It doesn't make evolutionary sense. But it works. The final report from the Galactic Safety Board was classified at the highest levels of government, but the executive summary was elegantly simple. Humans had somehow managed to weaponize compassion. They had taken their species' most apparently useless trait, their tendency to form emotional bonds with anything that moved, and turned it into a strategic advantage. The galaxy's most dangerous predators trusted humans with their offspring because humans were the only species that would risk everything to protect someone else's children. It was irrational, inefficient, and completely illogical. It was also the reason that, for the first time in recorded galactic history, interspecies youth facilities were reporting that their primary challenge was not containing dangerous younglings, but managing the waiting lists of species that wanted to enroll their children in human-supervised programs, the universe, it seemed, had played its ultimate joke. It had created species capable of reshaping reality, conquering star systems, and transcending the normal limitations of space and time, but it had also made their offspring completely immune to logic, reason, and the basic survival instinct that kept their parents alive. And then, almost as an afterthought, it had created one species that was perfectly adapted to handle chaos, irrationality, and the particular brand of beautiful madness that came with being young and trying to figure out how to exist in a universe that didn't always make sense. Humans, it turned out, were the galaxy's most dangerous species after all. They just happened to specialize in hunting down fear, loneliness, and the specific type of cosmic terror that came with being a small, confused being in a vast, incomprehensible universe. And in the end, that was exactly what the universe had been waiting for all along.